Zambia is one step closer to a deal that addresses its debt situation with bondholders as talks between the two groups have started. Now, at the end of June 2022, Zambia's total debt, including interest arrears, was $32.5 billion, with $17.5 billion external debt. Now, Zambia has been looking to restructure its debt after becoming the first African country to default during the COVID-19 pandemic in late 2020. The talks are a key step to restructuring more than $3 billion of overseas bonds. As Zambia's officials and creditors meet in person during the World Bank and IMF annual meetings in Marrakesh, discussions will reach advanced stages over agreements on the deal and ways to accelerate loan repayments. Joining me now is Trevor Hambai. He's Senior Managing Partner, Development Finance Associates. Trevor, welcome to Business Edge. It's good to have you again.
Thank you very much, and good to be back.
So in terms of what we know about Zambia's total debt, as I said, as of the end of June 2022, we're looking at $32.5 billion, including interest arrears, with about $17.5 billion worth of that being external. So many would ask, given that Zambia was the first African country to default in the COVID era, was this simply a result of the COVID-19 pandemic shocks, or was it really something that the COVID-19 pandemic sort of sped up? It was coming eventually.
So essentially, Zambia's debt default was a direct implication of poor fiscal management by the previous government. There were issues that were bordering around corruption. There were issues around pricing of infrastructure projects. And there were issues where the country continued to be able to borrow even when they could not afford to make the repayments. So essentially, and then we obviously got into a position where there was COVID. There was also a global challenge around the price of copper. Zambia is a one product dependent country on copper, and that also affected the revenue that they were generating. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Trevor.
Okay. So the impact really was because of the poor fiscal management of the country.
Okay, so when we look at that, because there's even the earlier conversation I had with my guest about this situation where the IMF is reducing the growth forecast for Nigeria and other sub-Saharan African countries, there's always been a conversation about what the money was taken for. So Zambia is said to have borrowed loans for short-term projects, infrastructure projects such as financing, building bridges, highways, and hospitals. These kind of projects that, as my guest probably referred to them as more consumption than productive. But then the country took longer than repayment time frame to return revenue and also socioeconomic value. So in terms of that increasing the country's debt outlook and looking at the rising interest rates and the repayments period, was there really no viable way of paying it back? Was Zambia also on track with what the loans were being used for? That's, I think, a very big issue for many African economies.
So understandably, what you'll find is that for most of the African countries is that the resources are not usually utilized for the purpose they are intended for. But secondly, also is an issue where these African countries need to be able to determine what their capacity is. In terms of infrastructure development, which is social spending, is that you can only use a certain portion while you take a greater portion towards the productive sector, so you have the resources to start to repay back. What we tried to do in the country as Zambia was to spend a large amount of money that we were pouring towards infrastructure. But the single factor that was driving this infrastructure spending was that government was then issuing contracts to politically connected people. And this was a way to siphon resources out of the treasury. Is the single largest factor that contributed to the country getting into a position where they couldn't afford this. And I think this is a challenge that seems to repeat itself so often among the African countries, that we take decisions that are not of the interest of the people, but more of the political leaders.
And something that I think many of us can definitely find similarities to. So let's come to the talks now. We've been waiting for these talks because since last year, to early 2023, it seems that the country has struggled to bring everybody to the table, to get those who are supposed to be involved in the restructuring plan, in the restructuring deal, to sit down and have these conversations. We know that there have been issues. The IMF and the World Bank has said they won't lend any further assistance until there's something on paper. So in terms of getting to a point where bondholders, creditors are sitting down, we're now hearing it's a bondholders conversation that's happening, or that's thankfully starting this week. Why has it been such a struggle for Zambia to get all the right people in the room at the table and negotiating on this?
I think the approach was very difficult for trying to get everybody to sit. Firstly, you'll appreciate that when Zambia defaulted on its repayment of external debt, the country was then put under a program, which is an IMF program, which was the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. The Debt Suspension Initiative is an IMF program. Zambia's major debtor is China. Half of the debt that we owe was Chinese. And then there was obviously a geopolitical conflict between the West and the East. So China was not willing to come to the table. And then this made it very, very difficult for the country to be able to negotiate. In terms of the bondholders, is that they had indicated that the IMF program had not taken them into consideration in terms of agreeing what terms they were going to give to the country. So they also took a very long time before they came to the table to be able to actually negotiate with the country. But Zambia was obviously riding on the strength of the Debt Suspension Initiative, because that is the only thing they had at the time to be able to stay in this position where they were not meeting their debt service obligation.
All right. So again, going back to where the whole conversation stood, at the end of 2022, Zambia's debt to international bondholders was about $3.5 billion, including $520 million interest in arrears. Now that these conversations, or these aspects of it, because we're still waiting to see what the movements will be when it comes to the creditors, what might be the considerations that we need to see, or we need to anticipate as these talks are kidding off? Trevor, what are we looking at when these talks are now starting? What should we be expecting? It's going to be an extended process to what is already an extended process, but what do you think are the considerations on the table?
So, obviously, in consideration, firstly, the overall picture around this is to restructure the debt. And technically speaking, is that they are hoping to be able to restructure the debt under the same terms and conditions that the official creditor have given the considerations to Zambia. Under the official creditors, which was basically the bilateral lenders, is that what has been agreed firstly is that the debt has been extended between 12 and 20 years in terms of repayment period. They've also reduced the interest rate to between 1% and 3%, as well as given a moratorium of 3 years on the principal before the country can start to repay. These are the specific details that were agreed with the bilateral lenders, and they're hoping that they can extend this so that they can have consistency in terms of the structure that the country will have in terms of dealing with its debt. But I think those are really the conditions they're trying to push that were initially provided by the bilateral lenders.
So according to some sources, a key step to restructure more than $3 billion of overseas bond is this situation now. So Zambia has 3 outstanding dollar bonds maturing in 2022, 2024, and 2027, trading at about 51 to 56 cents on the dollar. In terms of the cumulative value of the bonds, and if or not it will give enough impetus to the government's revenue mobilization efforts towards this debt repayments, what do you think?
So technically speaking, is that I keep saying for the country to be able to increase its capacity for domestic resource mobilization, is that it should have done this irrespective of where the negotiations are. Because really, domestic resource mobilization requires the country to be able to drive an economic recovery, which is going to increase its capacity to generate domestic taxes, which are then can be used to be able to meet this debt service on the international debt. The same issue that has happened, obviously, in this downgrade of potential GDP growth for most of the sub-Saharan Africa. Zambia's GDP has been downgraded from 4.7 to 2.7 for 2023. And we're going to see a marginal increase, I think, towards 4% for 2024 for. And essentially is that the countries, the African countries, need to be able to work towards having to accelerate the growth of their GDPs, because we seem to be aligned to the global market, but we have with a capacity and potential to be able to drive a faster GDP growth, even from the African continent's perspective, before we look at the global market. The global market obviously puts pressure on the African continent because of all the international prices of the raw materials that we do have, but we can still continue to add value there so that we're going to get better value for our resources to be able to drive GDP growth.
So it seems we're not going to end this on a bad note. Very quickly, Trevor, based on economic readings, we've seen Zambia's growth begin to recover since 2021, while inflation seems to also have stabilized below 10% from mid-2022, from a peak of about 25% in around the middle of 2021. And that's been driven by post-election currency appreciation. There are some other things happening. The fact that there are now deals taking place with bondholders. Creditors are also at the table as well. Even a group of the country's biggest private creditors have entered into a restricted period as well. Are things looking up for Zambia? Do you think we're going to end the year with some deals on the table that give the country breathing room into the next few years? Very quickly, please.
So I think in terms of the debt restructuring, there are a lot of positives that have happened there. The fact that the initial one under the official creditors, $6.3 billion, was already restructured. Now we're waiting to be able to have the MOUs signed with the private creditors. Other than the bondholders, there's another $3 billion that is owed to private creditors. I think positively, yes, that will happen. But the challenge that we still have seen is that there hasn't been any substantial economic growth within the country to actually deal with the specific challenges that the country is facing. And among those things is firstly the high cost of living. Secondly, it is the poverty levels in the country that are now at 60%, as well as the issue of very high unemployment in the country. Those ones are all going to have to dealt with a high growth in the GDP. That hasn't started to happen yet.
All right, so we have some very important economic indicators to look out for, but we also have these paces, some of these milestones finally being achieved along the way for Zambia and its restructuring talks. Trevor, thank you so much. I know we'll continue the conversation. We'll soon have you back.
Thank you very much.